Lena stood at the edge of the docking bay as the shuttle doors slid open behind her, and the strange scent of Drael atmosphere hit her like heat rising from metal. The station around her felt too silent, too watchful, with wide steel corridors that curved like ribs of some enormous beast. Massive Drael guards stood on both sides, staring at her not with curiosity, but with the cold interest of predators that had seen prey 1,000 times. Her boots echoed as she stepped forward alone, carrying nothing but a small datapad and the weight of her mission. She had been chosen not because she was a soldier, but because she was calm, smart, and good at reading cultures. She knew languages, emotions, and more importantly, silence. The Drell did not believe in open peace, but the Human Alliance had insisted on sending a neutral representative. She was it. Lena expected resistance, distrust, but she did not expect what she saw in the eyes of the Drael commander as he walked. Toward her, Thraxi was tall, broader than any human, and his skin had the shimmer of dark steel laced with faint red lines like veins glowing under the surface. His armor clanked, but not from weakness. It was ceremonial, worn like a crown, not a shield. His eyes were black with no whites, no pupils, and no expression. And yet as he looked at her, there was something behind those eyes, something old and full of calculation. He stopped just a few feet away, towering above her, and for a moment there was no sound. Not from him, not from her, not from the walls of the station around them. Then his voice came deep and deliberate, without emotion. "Why don't you fear me, human?" Lena did not answer at once. She simply looked up at him, her chin steady, her face neutral. She had studied his kind enough to know how they measured reactions. Fear was currency here. It earned respect and submission. But she was not here to give either. "I don't fear those who hide behind expectation," she said quietly, but clearly. "I fear the damage caused by misunderstanding more than threats." Thraxi did not blink. For a long moment he only stared. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward a long hallway, flanked by flickering wall panels and guards who stood still as statues. She walked forward without flinching, passing under their gazes. Behind her, Thraxi followed without a word, but the silence felt heavier now, as if her words had disrupted something inside the chamber prepared for her. Lena sat on the edge of a low bench and watched as Thraxi paced to the far side without sitting. The room was vast, bare, with no decoration, only a single curved table and 2 chairs. She placed her datapad in front of her and waited, but Thraxi said nothing. He watched her, and when he finally spoke again, it was not a command but a question. "You came here alone, no weapons, no guards. Your people know what we have done to others." "Yes," she said calmly, "and we remember what we did back there." Was a pause, not of offense, but of interest. Thraxi tilted his head slightly. "You mean the resistance?" "I mean the memory." Lena said, "Our species does not forget pain. But we also do not let fear shape our future." "You are a small species," he said. "Your numbers are scattered, your reach is limited. You survive but do not dominate. That is not strength." She leaned forward slightly and looked directly into his dark eyes. "Strength is not in size or reach. It is in standing when you have every reason to run." The silence that followed was deeper than before, not empty, but thoughtful. Thraxi had faced many leaders, many warriors, even diplomats from distant galaxies. They all came with trembling voices, with fear hidden behind formal words. Lena was different. Not louder, not prouder. Just still. He walked slowly toward the table, but did not sit. Instead, he placed one clawed hand on the metal surface and leaned slightly forward. "Why do you speak like this?" he asked softly, like a question that had haunted him longer than he admitted. "You are alone here. There is no fleet behind your words. No army waiting outside that door. What gives you the right to stand before me as if we are equals?" "Because I do not need permission to be human," she replied. He froze, and for the first time his face shifted slightly. Not in anger, not in confusion, in something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Or a memory from long ago when humans had first fought Drael ships with nothing but courage and chaos. He stepped back, slowly straightened, and looked at her, not as prey. Not as a lesser creature, but as something new. Something that did not fit his world. "You will dine tonight," he said finally. "You will speak again tomorrow." With that he turned and left the room, leaving Lena in silence once more, but this time the air felt different. It no longer pressed against her. It listened. The walls no longer stared. They watched. Somewhere deep inside this massive Drail station, a question had been planted, and it was growing not in Lena, but in Thrina as the door closed behind him. Lena sat back and exhaled slowly. Her hands did not shake. Her heart did not race. Because long before she stepped onto this station, she had made peace with the truth. Fear was not the absence of courage. It was the test of it, and whatever came next, she would face it as she always had. Not with weapons, not with power, but with presence, and now Thren knew that, even if he didn't understand why yet. Thren stood at the edge of the observation deck, staring out at the stars that glowed beyond the thick glass shield. His hands were behind his back and his breath was steady, but something inside him shifted like pressure beneath the surface of solid rock. His people had won 100 battles, had crushed resistance, had taken worlds, and rewritten the laws of weaker species. And yet the words of one quiet human had slipped through all the armor around his mind. He could still hear her voice, not raised, not proud, only certain. She had not flinched, she had not bowed, and now she sat in a guest chamber without guards while his own officers whispered about her in the corridors. He had seen fear become control in every negotiation before this. But not this time, not with her. She had brought no weapons, yet somehow left a wound behind elsewhere in the Drail communication. Center whispers moved faster than light. Rallo, the science officer, sat beside a flickering screen running data simulations, but his attention was elsewhere. He had seen the human enter without fear, and it disturbed the patterns he had always trusted. Drail dominance depended on fear, on psychological control. But the presence of someone who could not be moved by fear confused that logic. Rallo was not a warrior like Thren, he was a thinker, and thinkers saw patterns break. Before others even noticed, Rallo accessed a private file and brought up recordings from Earth campaigns, not the battle reports, but the human broadcasts during wartime. Their voices, their messages, their defiance even during loss. Humans cried, but they never surrendered in silence. They screamed, they burned, they rebuilt. What kind of creature survives by embracing fear rather than avoiding it in her room? Lena sipped water from a Drail crystal cup, studying the symbols on the walls around her. She felt the tension in the air, like static before a storm. She knew the words she had spoken reached deeper than she expected. Her role was not to provoke war, but to challenge assumptions, and already she had done that without raising her voice. A small chime sounded, and the door opened without ceremony. Thren entered again, this time without armor, only a dark layered robe that still reflected his status. He walked toward her, and this time sat across from her at the low table. She waited without speaking. "You say fear is not control," he began. "You say humans choose not to kneel. Yet your people have fallen before. You have tasted defeat." "Yes," she said calmly, "but defeat is not the end. It is only the moment before you stand again." His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but focus. He wanted to understand not just her words, but the machine behind them. "You confuse strength with stubbornness," he said. "Your kind survives but never dominates, perhaps because we know what it means to lose everything and still keep going." She replied softly. "Strength is surviving your own mistakes and still believing there is more ahead." Thren tapped one finger against the table, slow, deliberate movement that echoed slightly in the quiet room. "You remind me of the resistance fighters during the early wars," he said. "They screamed even as our fire rained down on them. They held ruined cities with no hope. I watched them die one by one, refusing to run. It was not logic. It was not strategy. It was something else. It was humanity," she said. He stared at her longer this time, and something in his expression changed again. Not fully visible, but like a shadow slipping behind the eyes. He stood up but did not turn away. "Tell me one thing," he said. "Not as a commander, but as something older. "What do you fear?" She did not answer immediately. She looked at him, and then at the walls, and then down at the table, and then back into his eyes. "We fear becoming like you," she said. "Not because you are powerful, not because you are strong, but because you forget why life matters when you stop questioning." Your own path. Thren did not respond. He turned and walked to the door, then paused just before it opened. "You are not what I expected. You never asked what to expect," she replied. The door slid open and closed behind him, leaving her alone again, but not really alone. Because she knew now that a line had been crossed in his mind. Not broken, not shattered, but bent, and once something bends, it remembers that shape forever. In the Drail Strategy Hall, a meeting had already started, and officers gathered around. A wide table showing data projections and fleet positions. Rollo entered. Late, his eyes focused, his thoughts racing. "She is not a soldier," he said, suddenly cutting through the formal reports. "She is not a spy and not a weapon, but she is more dangerous than all three." The others looked at him confused, some annoyed, but Thren, who had just entered, raised a hand for silence. "Blaine," he ordered. "She speaks without force," he said. "She stands without defense. And still we react. Why is that?" "Because she is here to provoke," said one officer. "No," Rollo said, "because she is here to show us something we never see in ourselves." "Sound like you admire her," someone muttered. "No," he said. "I fear what her words might awaken." Silence fell again, and Thren looked around the room as if seeing it differently. "If she speaks again tomorrow," said Thren, "I will listen, not as a commander, but as a question." That night the station lights dimmed to rest mode, but the thoughts of many inside stayed bright. Lena looked out her small window and saw the endless stretch of stars and the curve of a nearby moon. She knew tomorrow would be harder and deeper. Because now Thren had begun to listen, she whispered quietly to herself a line from Earth she had always remembered from a history book. Not a weapon, but an idea. The strongest walls fall not from force, but from truth that keeps knocking. And she was knocking. She always had been. The station moved silently through the edge of the stars, while tension grew inside its cold metal walls like a silent storm waiting to break. Lena sat inside the Drail archive chamber, surrounded by ancient tablets and language scrolls carved in symbols that once belonged to races long erased. Her fingers hovered above one of the oldest Drail artifacts, a record of conquest and victory, written in stone and shadow. She studied it not to admire it, but to understand the soul behind it. The Drail were not just conquerors, they were storytellers of fear, and every tale they preserved carried the same lesson. Rule through strength, silence through power behind her. The door slid open, and Thren stepped in without a sound, his eyes sharper today, like a blade that had remembered its purpose. He did not sit, he only looked around the room, then back at her, his voice steady, but without its usual weight. "Why do you study our past so closely?" "Because I want to see the moment it changed," she replied without looking up. "The moment fear became your language. You believe we were different once. Everyone was different once," she said. "The question is not what you were, it is what you are becoming." Thren walked closer slowly, his steps measured like the thoughts building behind his gaze. "What do you see in us that we do not see?" "You see fear as control," she said. "But I see fear as a mirror. What you show others is what you are hiding from yourselves." He said nothing at first, then turned to one of the walls, placing his hand on an old map of conquests across systems. "You think fear weakens us?" "No," she said. "I think fear has already weakened you, and now you are trapped inside it." Ren remained still for a long time, and when he turned back to her, his eyes had changed again. "Not soft, not broken, but less guarded. Our soldiers speak of you now," he said. "They do not understand your calm. They say you are dangerous." "Danger is not always loud," she said. "Sometimes it whispers and waits for the right moment to rise elsewhere in the wise elsewhere. In the whispers, and waits for the right moment to rise elsewhere in the west, to rise elsewhere in the..." Command Wing Rollo watched the internal communication threads being flooded with quiet discussions about the human envoy. Her presence had caused ripples in the order and pattern of Drail life. Some called her threat, Others called her Shadow, but none dismissed her anymore. That alone was proof of change. In a private message to Thren, Rollo wrote one line of question. Not of doubt, but of urgency. What if fear is not control, but blindness, Thren? Read the message as he walked down the corridor after leaving Lena's chamber. He did not reply. Instead, he stepped into a war room filled with simulation screens glowing with light and sound. A recorded battle between humans and Drael forces played on loop, showing the raw chaos and resistance that humanity had once offered. He watched a moment where a small human outpost refused to fall for hours despite being surrounded. Their signals screamed defiance, their banners never dropped. And even in loss, they had forced the Drael to retreat once he stared at the screen. As one human soldier stood atop rubble, holding the broken flag in one hand and a rifle in the other, his face bloodied but eyes still full of purpose. The image froze there, and Thren felt something in his chest shift, not pain, not regret, something colder and deeper. The memory of watching and not understanding. Later in the council chamber, the debate rose higher. Officers shouted about weakness, about needing to remind humans of their place, about striking now before talks corrupted strength. But when Thren entered, the noise stopped and all eyes turned toward him. You want to strike now, he said. But for what? To prove we are still feared. To silence a voice that has not even spoken. War she plants doubt, one said, and doubt spreads faster than fire. Then we should ask why it spreads so easily, said Rollo, stepping forward. Why does her presence reach even the strongest of our soldiers? What does that say about our foundation? Thren looked at them, all his expression unreadable. He knew their fears because he felt them too, but fear no longer looked the same. It had a new face now, and it spoke in calm words and unwavering eyes. Dismissed, he said. The chamber emptied, but the silence left behind was loud. Meanwhile, Lena sat across from a projection device, watching a replay of a Drael leader's ancient speech. The words were strong, absolute, full of domination and pride. But in those words she also heard fear, the kind buried under control. She whispered quietly, not to herself, but to the walls that now seemed to lean closer. You built walls to keep enemies out, but now you cannot see past them. Thren entered once more, and this time there was no guard at the door, no weapon at his side. He sat across from her and waited. Tell me, he said, not as commander, not as Drael. Tell me what you truly believe. She looked at him, not as enemy, not as threat, but as someone who might finally hear. I believe that fear is not meant to be passed down. Like tradition, I believe fear teaches, but it should not lead. And I believe you are afraid, because for the first time something stronger than fear stands before you, and you cannot control it. Did not move, not even blink, you confuse your courage with chaos, he said. No, she said. We have lived through chaos. We built ourselves inside it. That is why we do not shake when you raise your voice. That is why we do not break when you expect surrender. And what do you want from us? Not surrender, she said. Not weakness, understanding, nothing more, nothing less. Thren stood slowly and walked to the edge of the room. He placed one hand against the cold steel wall and stood there for a long moment. We are not used to being questioned. Maybe that is why you should be. When he left the chamber that time, he did not walk like before. He walked slower, as if carrying something heavier not on his shoulders, but in his mind. And across the station, the echo of her words reached corners where silence used to live. Drael's soldiers spoke her name without hatred, some with curiosity, others with something closer to uncertainty, and in one quiet lab Rollo saved a new file label. Human factor status active. Artificial daylight passed slowly over the surface of the Drael station, as tension spread deeper than light could reach. In the core halls, where only authorized voices spoke and footsteps fell in rhythm, there were now spaces filled with something new. Doubt moved like shadow, without sound and without warning, and it followed every conversation about the human who had arrived without fear. Lena stood near the observation dome, watching the soft swirl of dust around the nearby asteroid belt. Her hands were folded behind her back and her face calm as ever, but her thoughts raced. She had seen the shift not just in Thren's behavior, but in the air itself. Something had begun to unravel, and the Drael were not prepared for it. They had spent years mastering control, yet now that control was being questioned, not with weapons, not with revolt, but with words they could not unsee. Rollo entered without a sound, as he always did, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with quiet urgency. He stood beside her for a while before speaking. "The council grows restless," he said. "Some demand your removal, others believe your presence. Here is the beginning of change they cannot predict." "They are right," Lena replied softly. "I did not come here with threats, but I brought change all the same. Change is dangerous for those who built their peace upon fear." She turned to face him and saw something deeper in his expression than caution. She saw understanding. "What about you, Rollo? What do you believe?" "I believe in patterns," he said. "I believe in logic and in how small disruptions often break the strongest walls." "Then, you already know this wall has begun to crack." He nodded and left without another word, but not all Drael accepted the slow wave of change. In a silent corner of the military wing, a small group gathered without clearance, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes burning with pride and anger. They believed the human was a threat not because of her actions, but because of her effect. They feared what their soldiers would become if fear no longer ruled them. To them the Drael were supreme, and doubt was treason, so they moved in secret and planned with silence. It would not be a public act, but a warning to restore order through the only language they trusted. Forced that night, Lena walked down the long curved corridor toward the central discussion hall where Thren had requested her presence. Her steps were light and her thoughts steady. She was ready to speak once more, not for power, not for praise, but because this moment demanded truth. And she was ready to offer it without armor. But as she passed a narrow corridor, the lights above flickered without warning, and within seconds 4 Drael figures emerged, their faces hidden, their weapons drawn not to threaten but to kill. There was no time for warning, no time for reason. One aimed a pulse weapon toward her chest and pulled the trigger. But fate does not follow the plans of cowards. From the side, another figure leapt from the shadows, knocking the weapon aside just as it discharged. The blast hit the wall, and sparks flew across the hallway. Guards responded in seconds, alarms lit up the ceiling, and the corridor erupted into chaos. It was Rollo who had acted first. He had seen the strange movement of those 4 earlier and followed in silence. He had not been trained for combat, but he had been trained to recognize intention. And what he saw in their posture had told him everything. Now he stood over Lena, shielding her as more guards arrived and arrested. The attackers. Lena sat against the wall, her breath uneven, her shoulder scorched, but her eyes still sharp. She looked at Rollo and nodded once, then turned toward the figures being dragged away. "They are not afraid of me," she said quietly. "They are afraid of what they will become if they start to see through me." News of the attack spread faster than fire across the station. Thren arrived at the scene within minutes, and when he saw Lena injured, his silence became iron. He looked at the captured attackers, and then at his command guards. "They are no longer Drael," he said. "Take them away, strip their ranks, remove their access. They do not speak for you." She turned to Lena, then not as a leader, not as a superior, but as a man standing on the edge of change. "You should not be standing right now," he said. "And yet I am," she replied. He helped her to her feet and walked beside her toward the hall. Not once did she lean on him, and not once did he expect her to later. As she stood in the center of the high chamber, filled with commanders, soldiers, and observers, her voice echoed, not through speakers, but through silence that waited to hear. She did not speak of the attack. She did not mention the weapons or the fear. She spoke of fire, of broken cities, of humans who had lost everything and still stood again. She spoke of the child who had written poems in ashes, the farmer who had rebuilt fields over ruins, the scientist who had kept dreaming even in bunkers. She spoke of her kind not as survivors, but as reminders that fear was not an end. When she finished, the chamber remained still, no applause, no motion, only thought. And thought was the most dangerous sound of all. Thren stood and faced the assembly. The County? Time has come to listen, not just to respond, he said. This human speaks with more than voice. She speaks with memory, and memory is the only weapon. We have never learned to resist. No one spoke against him. No one walked out that night in his private chamber. Thren watched the stars again. Not for peace, not for comfort, but because they were constant and silent and far from the noise of Power-Allo. Entered briefly and placed a datapad on his deskets. Begun, he said. Transmission of her speech has reached the outer fleets. Thren nodded. Let it reach them all across. The cold, quiet corridors of the Drail station, one message pulsed brighter than any alarm. She stood without fear, and still she stands, and that was not weakness, that was the beginning. The days moved slower after the speech, and something deep in the heart of the Drail station had changed even if no one spoke of it out loud. The silence that once ruled the halls was no longer a silence of power, but a silence of thought. Officers walked slower, not from hesitation, but from awareness. Young Drail soldiers now watched human broadcasts in secret, not to mock them, but to understand the fire behind those soft faces. It was no longer about the human girl who did not fear. It was about the reason behind her calm and the storm it had awakened. Lena stood near the center of the grand observation deck as final preparations for departure began. She had been cleared to leave the station, but she knew she would not leave unnoticed. Her words had reached more ears than she expected, and now even those who doubted her voice began to carry questions they had never dared to ask. She looked across the starlit window one last time, letting her eyes follow the curve of distant galaxies. Not as threats, not as mysteries, but as futures waiting to be shaped. Behind her, the doors opened, and Thren entered with no guards, no ceremony, no warning. He had shed the weight of armor days ago, and now walked in the simple robes of his ancestors, once worn before the Drail became conquerors. His face held no pride, no coldness, only the marks of a leader who had seen what power could not protect. And what silence could no longer hide. You are leaving, he said, though it was not a question. I have said all I came to say, she replied quietly. The rest belongs to those who heard. You were supposed to be a representative, not a force. And yet here we. Arethrin looked out the window beside her and spoke with a voice no longer shaped by command, but by memory. When I was young, I watched my father order the fall of a world because its leaders would not kneel. He told me it was necessary to teach fear, and I believed him because I knew nothing else. But I remember that world. I remember a child standing in front of a burning house holding a broken instrument, still trying to play a song. Lena turned to him and saw that his voice did not shake, but it no longer carried the sound of pride. It carried the echo of something older, something forgotten. That child would have grown up fearing us, he continued. But what if that child grew up and came back not with weapons, but would I recognize that courage? Would I know that strength? Would I stand before it or turn away? You chose to listen, she said. That is already your answer. Thren lowered his head for a moment, then raised it slowly. You have given us something we never expected. Not peace, not surrender, but reflection. And for U.S. that is harder than war. Outside the station, a transport ship arrived, gliding silently through the void. Its hull bore the insignia of the Human Alliance, and its lights blinked like slow heartbeats across the dark. Lena watched it approach and felt no victory, no triumph, only purpose fulfilled. Thren stepped back as she moved toward the exit, but just before she reached the door, he spoke again. There are still many who will resist this change. Many who will hold on to fear because it is all they know. But there are others who now wonder what we are without it. And that is because of you. She paused at the door, then turned slightly. I did not come here to change your world. I only came to remind it that change was possible. He gave a slow nod, and for the first time since they met, he smiled, not wide, not forced, only real. When the ship docked, she entered without hesitation and did not look back. The crew saluted her, but she waved them off with kindness. She was not a hero, not a symbol, only a voice that had found the right place to speak. As the ship undocked and drifted away, the Drail station remained behind her, smaller with distance. But never small in memory, back on Earth days later, a gathering was held to welcome her return. Officials praised her courage, the media chased her name, the records marked her presence as historic. But she spoke little, only answered questions when needed, and avoided the spotlight. She did not want her name remembered louder than the message. In her room she sat with a single plant near the window, watching the sun stretch over buildings made of old stone and new steel. A world that had once burned now blooming again, far away in Drael territory. A council was being rebuilt, not with the same voices, not with the same rules. Thren stood before a new circle of leaders, some older, some young, and placed a stone on the floor before them, a symbol from his world, meaning recognition of truth. He did not speak of conquest. He spoke of connection. He spoke of fear not as strength, but as shadow. And he spoke of a human who stood without trembling, even when the room expected her to fall across the fleets. The message continued to spread, not as an order, not as a law, but as a question. Who are we when fear no longer defines using time? The Drael did not become human. But they became more than they were. They questioned, they hesitated, they remembered. And remembering was the first step in the quiet space above Earth. Thren stood aboard a neutral ship looking down at the blue world he once believed weak. He watched. Its waters, its clouds, its endless movement, and he saw not softness but survival beside. Hinralo spoke without turning. Do you still fear them? Thren shook his head slowly. No. I fear what we would have become if we had never met them, as the ship turned. Back toward the stars, a single file remained open on Ralo's screen, a file that began as a warning and now stood as a record. Label human factor status changing everything, and far below on Earth. Lena sat near the window, still calm, still watching, still ready, because change was never loud, it was steady, and it had only just begun the end.